That's that's interesting. You mentioned your working relationship with the Faculty Association and Bill Bulger. What was your working relationship like with the students on campus?
This went to place because they had been the most restive, according to the administration. They were revolting against the presence of parietal rules, which were quite strict about what hours they had to be in the dormitories and so on. Parietal rules don't exist anymore, but they did then, and they were a matter of considerable concern. Plus, the administration in those days made no distinction between off-campus and on-campus. Students were students all the time, and whether their offenses were committed on or off campus, the campus concerned itself with it. And I thought that was carrying in loco parentis too far. His attention was devoted to the students, and we got rid of the most obnoxious of the parietal rules, and the students felt that they had, in a sense, won in their battle with the administration. I think it was a mistake on my part to devote my first attention to the students. I wish in retrospect that I had devoted my first attention to the faculty. The faculty was more discontented than I understood.
Welcome back to Student Activism Then and Now. I'm Amy Robinson, and we're delighted to still have you with us. If you're watching online, we invite you to leave comments or questions there, and if we have time, we'll certainly get to them. Let me introduce our second panel now. And so we are going to welcome John Childs. And John is from Ann Arbor and has some interesting things he's going to talk about with us in terms of the family impact. And John, you'll be explaining it for us, but his brother was in Vietnam and his father was not a supporter of activism at the time he was an activist. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Denny Adams is joining us from Mount Pleasant. And Denny also has a family perspective in that while he was going to college here and protesting, he was a young father with a son at home. For example, we'll be talking about those aspects. Welcome to Pleasant. The personal is political, and she is a great person to really in the activism here at CMU.
I graduated from Plymouth High School in '68, and my politics were either apolitical or moderate Republican. My parents were both Republicans. In fact, my mother was mayor of Plymouth at the time. My father was a Marine Corps pilot, test pilot during World War II. The Chicago Convention is what radicalized me. All these people getting beat up for not doing anything. And I said, this can't be right. After that, I started investigating, looking into the Vietnam War, reading some books, how this all started way back before Truman, and why they've been kind of screwed over by the United States telling them one thing and then switching sides back and forth. So in '69, I got involved with the moratorium, the big march in Washington, 500,000 people, and helped to organize the buses, which was difficult because we had the buses set up, and when the companies found out what it was for, they'd cancel it, and then let's take the buses. Finally, President Boyd intervened. He also helped us. We said, hey, we paid for this food, can we get some boxed lunches? So the food service made us all boxed lunches to take. So we went, and the march was wonderful. We got to meet a lot of people, and it was really a great experience. Then when the Kent State thing happened, things got much more ugly. You know, now we realize they're willing to shoot students. And that's when we decided. We were running off copies of Ethel in the student government office. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, let me stop you right there. Ethel, that's life backwards. and that was and this was another a student publication.
Yeah, actually, Andy Marks and Paul Jagano are in the audience, so they're really responsible with Byron Cuxhouse for getting it started. And they kept begging in the pay, hey, can somebody come and help us? So we went, originally we just started helping them run stuff off on the machines and type stuff up, and eventually we kind of took it over.
And so we didn't have social media, we had Ethel. So
500 copies.
all right. Now, as you were getting into your activism, you had a father who was a pilot and in the military, and you had a brother serving in Vietnam.
That's right. Well, actually, when we first started, my brother was here at Central. When we went to the moratorium march, I had called my dad and I said, you know, we're getting this set up. I'm responsible for food and buses and stuff. And he said, if you go, I'll cut you off. You're done. I won't give you any more money. It's over. So the day we were supposed to go, and he sent me a letter, the only letter he ever sent me, talking about his experiences in the war as a test pilot, you know, having to land and put one of his buddies in the back of his plane because his head had been chopped off and things. It was pretty raw, and he'd never talked about it. So the day I was supposed to go, I called him up. I called him at work, which we never did. The only time I ever called him at work. And he answered, E.E.? And I said, yes, this is John. He said, yeah, and we talked a little bit. And he finally said, you know, you think this is as right as I think it's wrong, so I guess you have to go. But I'm not happy about it. So that's how that all happened.
That was pretty good acceptance for someone who felt so passionately the other way.
Yes, it was. I mean, my older brother who went to Nam in '71, and when he came back, I picked him up at the airport, and he said, let's just ride around. His wife had divorced, her mother was over there, and he didn't really want to talk about it. In fact, we talked about everything else, but we never talked about the war. About 5 years ago, he was being treated for cancer, and his wife called and said, could you come out here to New Jersey? He's not eating. I think if you come, you know, we can get him to eat. So I went out there, and we ate milkshakes 3 times a day, and I put on about 20 pounds, and his weight stabilized. And I asked him at that time, I said, and that was the first time he brought out a book that he had of photos from Vietnam. And I said, well, were you ever mad at me? Here I was protesting the war, and you were over there. And he said, no. He said, you know, Dad always told us we were to follow our own beliefs and do what we thought was right. And that's what I did, and that's what you did. So no, I was never angry about it. And he said, besides, see these shoes? All my shoes are made in Vietnam.
Well, how was it for you to be protesting and be an activist with perhaps divided loyalties in the sense that you felt passionate about what you were doing, but you wondered how your family was viewing it?
Well, it made, you know, Thanksgiving, Christmas dinners difficult because it always came up. We couldn't not talk about it because I would usually say, hey, did you see, especially once the Pentagon Papers came out and we said, you know, you've been telling us we were wrong all along. We were right. We told you this is what was going on. And so it got pretty heated sometimes, especially when Mike was in Vietnam. So, and then when the Days of Rage in May of '71, where it was, if the government won't stop the war, we'll stop the government. Yeah. So we went out to D.C. and we went on the street. I had a helmet on, a motorcycle helmet. And the police had been told, everybody in helmets are leaders. So as soon as I stepped on the street, they grabbed me. And they had these big, like, semi-trucks. And they had it divided up with a woman's cell on one side and a men's cell on the other. And so they roughed us up and threw us in there. And there was one other guy in there, and I said, gosh, I guess I'm going to need a lawyer. And he said, oh, I'm a lawyer. And it was Lenny Weinglass who helped defend the Chicago 7. And they had picked him up by his license plate just coming into town. So once they had the van full, they took us over where they were holding us at this big field. And when we got there, Lenny said, we can tip this over if we just shift our weight. So we started shifting weight, and the thing starts to rock. And everybody that was already in the field came rushing over and started pushing the fence down. So they popped open the door and pepper grenade and closed the door. And it got very hard to breathe. Yeah, it was, but it calms people down instantly. So while we were there, you know, Bella Abzug and some other people were coming in. They were saying, hey, you know, this is too bad. This shouldn't have happened. Then they took us to an arena somewhere, and they were processing us, the largest mass arrest in U.S. history. And we're the only people ever to be given financial compensation for a violation of our constitutional rights. So while I was there, we had a lot of time because obviously 12,000 people, it takes a while to do them. And there were some senators and representatives up in the stands. And they were, hey, come up here, come up here. So we went up, and the guy said, can I call your parents and tell them what's happened? And I said, yeah. So my parents got woken up in the middle of the night and said, hello, this is Senator so-and-so. Your son's been illegally arrested in Washington, D.C., and we're fighting to get him free right now. So I think my dad and mom were like, whoa, what's he doing there? You know, because they didn't know about any of that.
So let me ask you, when it comes to being so involved in activism and protest, how, if at all, can you guard against what I would call message drift? You wanted to protest the war, and many of you have said, working for the soldiers to bring them home so fewer people died. And yet it was, I want to know often, but it certainly was viewed at times as maybe critical of the soldiers themselves. How do you guard against that?
Yeah, I think that was hard, because there was some anger at the soldiers. Although most of our anger was directed toward these guys being sent there. We all know people that had been sent. My brother was fairly old. He was 25 when he went. Most people were like 18 and 19. In fact, when he was there, his sergeant came up to him on his 26th birthday and said, Sergeant Childs, happy birthday. You're no longer eligible for the draft. So he went in November 71, and Nixon said in December 71, no more draftees will be sent to Vietnam. But it was hard, you know, you had to, you know, we were very radical. We were upset about stuff, but when we took over the ROTC building, and like I say, we were running off Ethel at the time, and one of our friends, who's remain nameless, came in with chains and locks, and he said, you know, Kent State, we're taking the building. So we went in and locked it up. We never tried to take the armory, because we were, you know, I said, the optics of this have to be, we're a peace group. And if we get violent, the TV makes us look like the bad guys. We can't do that. So thanks to Rick Kajerski and Boyd, we talked back and forth a little bit. We had several meetings saying, you know, how are we going to end this? Some people wanted to, you know, be violent about it. Some people, you know, we said, let's just be the bigger person. We'll walk out and say, you know, we really don't want this war. We think ROTC should be off campus, and let's go with that. So it turned out very well, but President Boyd was very, you know, involved in that. And if it hadn't been for him, it probably could have gotten pretty bloody. So I was glad for that.
All right, we appreciate that, your comments. And let me mention to our audience watching at home, you can send questions or comments. And we do have a comment from a librarian, a Mount Pleasant native, who messaged us saying, during their years at CMU, we also protested what is now known as the global war on terror. I want to encourage all of you and those in any generation who participated in movements to donate the materials of the movement to local libraries or archives. The history is important, and we should be proactive in protecting it and preserving that.
A lot of things came out of the Vietnam movement, the Earth Day idea, the women's movement, some of the African American stuff. The movement started to split a little bit, and after the war was pretty much over, people went in and started doing different things. So a lot of the people who were involved didn't just fade away, the war's over, we're done. They got interested in doing other things and trying to change things.
Denny, while John had concerns or thoughts of his brother in Vietnam and his father being opposed to his activism, you had a little one at home waiting for Dad to come home from the protests. How did that impact your activities?
Well, I mean, it had some impact. I just wanted to speak for a moment of the overview of the time frame, because the one thing I notice about students today and being around campus, especially in the summer when you can hear things, the icons of rock and roll and protest and music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, these were our compatriots. These are the people our age. There was a countercultural revolution starting before the war protest really started. And so I see all of this kind of coming out of that once we said, okay, we are our own people. We have this cultural thing that's happening. You know, some like to label it sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But there were certainly a lot of serious things going on, especially when it got to the point where our brothers were coming home in body bags, and Vietnam became a real threat to all the males especially, and there certainly were some of our women compatriots who served in Vietnam that had that same fate, so it wasn't strictly male. But the opportunity And I think that was the thing that struck me most about getting ready for this, was going back and looking at the time frame. I think I mentioned to you at lunch that the only thing I had firmly fixed was my daughter's birth date on December 1st, 1968, and I knew I graduated at the end of 1970. So it's like, okay, when did these things fall into place? And just as an example, the one semester that I was editor of CM Life, the fall of 1970, we had 3 primary big speakers on campus in that 17 weeks. First was Dick Gregory, then was Tom Hayden, and then was Jane Fonda. And we had music. We had the Temptations. We had Neil Diamond. We had, MC5. I mean, there were lots of things going on. And so I guess what my word to current activists is, you don't have to be out in the street and carrying signs. I encourage you to do that. But even getting on the university's committee to select speaker series, to select music, these all are people that have effects on your culture of now in this time. There's things to be learned from us, and there's things to be, avoided the mistakes we made, some of the things that we can talk about tonight. So in that sense, the most important 2 to 4 years of your life are that 18 to 20, 22 years age, usually while we're in college. But one of the most edifying things in the anti-war movement and with the moratorium and marches was we really moved off the college campus. There's always been this idea that if you're in college, you're some egghead, and these things happen on campuses, not in our community. And when we finally recognized that we had to go to talk to our compatriots that were working in the factories in Flint, in the factories in Lansing. They weren't in college, they were out in the real world working, but they were all our age, and they all had a number in the draft, so they all had the same pressure from what we were looking at. So that kind of, sealed the framework of what was going on.
What was your involvement in protests here on campus?
I was there when we went in the building at the ROTC building, Freedom Hall. And you need to also know, this was basically an empty, worthless building on campus. The only thing in it was about a 10 by 14 office where the ROTC was. And the rest of it was an old gymnasium. It was originally the Finch Fieldhouse. Central Hall was the field house back in the day. So now an occasional archery program was in there. There wasn't much going on. And the funny thing was, I always joked about it after the fact, if we had burned the building down, the university was 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, paid somebody to tear it down. We would have burned it down for them for free, and they could have collected the insurance, but sometimes they didn't follow my suggestions. That's probably a good thing. But I was the editorial director at CM Life at that time, and of course, my politics at the time were very far to the left of most of the rest of the people in the journalism department. So I found my way in the editorial part of that. I just went back to see that semester and realized, boy, I didn't really write that many editorials. And often there'd be somebody else on the staff that write one that was like the complete opposite of what I wrote. But I was happy that I had some influence then. If anybody remembers a great cartoonist named R. Cobb, back in the day, had great political cartoons. My favorite is a military person standing on a rock with a smoking machine gun, and all you can see to the horizon is dead bodies, and it just says, "I win." And that's the kind of stuff that Cobb did. So I was able to kind of get that in there on alternate with Frankly Speaking. And then, the year that I became editor, I was able to do a few other things. I brought in Liberation News Service, which was an alternative news service to AP and UPI, and we would use stories that I felt fit. One got me in a lot of trouble, got a lot of flack from, was a story about the Vietnam Veterans Against the War staging a guerrilla theater action in a small town in Ohio with a little circle square. So they all came in uniformed with wooden guns like we used to march in the marching ships with, and had other friends dressed in black attire of the rice paddy workers in Vietnam. So the army came in, they made bang, bang, bang noises, everybody in the pajamas slapped ketchup on themselves and fell on the ground, and oh my God, the community went crazy because they thought they were actually being attacked, and then right in the middle of it, they stopped and started talking to people about, everybody stood up and they said, okay, this is why we did this. But there were people in this community who wanted to hang me for even publishing that story, but that's the kind of, you know, approach that we took. When you couldn't get people to hear your voice, you went out and looked for things that made them stop and listen to what you were doing, which was part of what the protest was about.
Let me ask you this, because I know you were careful to some extent about the protests that you participated in personally. For example, not going to D.C. because as a dad with a family, a wife and a child, you didn't really feel you could afford to be arrested.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was
and
a whole
what'd you
issue.
say, you'd have to hit up the mother-in-law for your
Well,
bail
right,
money?
that was probably the biggest part of it. If I knew I went, I'd end up in jail and need a bail money, and I wasn't going to ask my mother-in-law for it. So,
and yet you're in a position to publish, you know, provocative articles and to encourage this kind of dialogue, this kind of conversation. What kind of pushback did you feel from the community? Not on a personally threatening level, but just people who were not happy with what you were doing.
One of the things I made sure to do, if you go back and look at that semester of papers, you will see every time, probably 4 or 5 times, the number of column inches of editorial space dedicated to readers' responses. Sometimes I'd run 2 pages of letters, and they were often critical of me, critical of other things that were happening on campus. Nobody liked Jerry Rubin using foul language, you know. So like I said, we dropped him off on I-94 at Detroit, made him walk to the terminal because we were so upset with him when we took him back. But that's a whole other story. But you have to, you know, with position comes responsibility. And, you know, I mean, there were people in my own newsroom when I was editor that didn't speak to me because they didn't like my politics. But yet, I made sure they got their column inches, even if they were writing something against me. I remember, you know, publishing dual things. I said mine, they said theirs, you know, next to each other. It's about the forum. And I guess that's my message to activists today is, in my life perspective, I look back and I remember my times here in that era, and it's this big. I mean, it's like, oh my God, this was the time of my life. And then I go back and went, December of 68 to the end of 70, that's 2 years. Look what happened in those 2 years of time, and it was just amazing. And for any of those who haven't taken the opportunity, I think the moratorium booklet is out there. The most stunning thing to me is the picture that's in that booklet. When we had a candlelight march here in Mount Pleasant against the war, and we're talking about 69, October, November 60, and 69, and there were 13,000 students at the university. There were barely more than that people living in Mount Pleasant, maybe 18,000. And we had 5,000 people in the street at night with candles. There's a picture from the tower of Warner Hall. You can see all the way to the town center in Mount Pleasant, and a solid column, 2 lanes wide of road of people marching with candles. And that's, you know, and that's what came to be. There were people that came from all over, even nearby counties, to be in that march because everybody had been touched by a body bag returning, their boyfriend from high school coming back without a leg. I mean, these are the kinds of realities that we face, certainly much more so now because of our great ability to triage in war. We have a lot more veterans coming back with a lot more serious injuries. In Vietnam, they died. You know, they just didn't make it back. So there is that aspect of it, but take advantage of your time. It's a short 4 years here. Go for it. Nothing can happen to you in terms of expressing your opinion and pushing for what you in your heart feel to be right, other than having to defend yourself. And if you can't defend what you do, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. But there are so many opportunities now in so many levels, and John kind of touched on it with, I look back at that and that era from 68 to 72, Women's Aid started, Listening Ears started, the Tenants Union, the first ACLU chapter here, Green Tree Grocery was then Mount Pleasant Food Co-op started. So some of my friends would often say, yeah, we patted ourselves on the back and the war was over, and then we let those guys we argued with all the time go take over politics. And I said, no. You know, people went into teaching, people went into social work, people started other organizations to serve people. That whole concept of what we talked about culturally, I think most of us went out and did. And one of the great lessons I always told to my daughter when she went off to college was, I said, just remember, you know, some money costs too much to make. And she never understood that until she got out, got a high-paying job, got stabbed in the back because somebody right behind her wanted a little more money, and that whole thing. And I think that those of us who went into other areas of thing, I mean, the first thing, my first job out was with the Department of Social Services. So you know, that was a great thing to me. I just found it unsatisfying and walked away from it because it changed from the Great Society programs with a 2-page application to the newer way of looking at persons who receive welfare, and it became a 36-page application that you had to bring a note from everybody you know, even though it's supposed to be that nobody knows you're an assistant. So, you know, but to students today, there's so many opportunities, so many opportunities.
Put a lot into your 2 years. Thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Matt, you have a great perspective on history of protest here at CMU that really translates into a larger message in terms of continuity and how to continue and really accomplish something. Let's talk about that. First of all, tell me, when did you show up at CMU and kind of how did it fit into the activism moment?
I showed up in '72, and I was very disappointed that I missed all the good stuff. And this actually kind of goes into the continuity thing. I came in, first year I did student government because that's where you kind of look and go, well, that must be where politics are. And the next year I did Mountain Rush with Ron. And the summer came up, and I'm going, well, great, let's do something. And there's no Ron. There's no nothing. It's just me, and I wanted to put through you have orientation here. I wanted to create a disorientation manual to pass out to all of the students who were coming to go through orientation. And I contacted a lot of groups. I didn't know squat what I was doing except for what I'd learned for a year working with the Rushers. I could do layout. I knew something about writing articles, but man, some of those were terrible. I didn't even know where the printer was until finally somebody told me where the printer was, and I handed the stuff out. And I got really, and we got people to show up the next year because I'd go around to all the organizations that I knew. If I could find somebody left, I'd say, hey, write me something. And if I couldn't do that, I'd find something some student was, a friend of mine who I knew would do it. Like, could you review all the bars in the area? I found volunteers. That was very easy to do. And so there is a continuity, and I was lucky because I got here in '72. The unlucky was it wasn't a little earlier, and I stuck around till '81. So I got to see a lot of stuff, and I could see how these things progressed. And some of the things that I noticed and I learned, because I did Mountain Rush, I did Purgem, which is a public interest research group in Michigan, which is an offshoot of Nader's Raiders, and some things that we tried, like one of the things was we were told by the university that if we could prove it, that Purgem had enough support, we will let you get funding. So we went out and we got over half of the students to sign a petition. Now, if they checked the signatures, there may have been a couple doubles and triples, but still, we got a huge amount of petitions. And when we showed up, said, here we are, and they gave us exactly what they offered us at the very beginning. Nothing. There was we got nothing for all that effort except for spending a whole year collecting. A year ago, there was a student group here on campus called CM Action. They went around and they wanted to collect signatures because they wanted to prove to the university that there was a gender and sexuality center should be placed on campus. They got 2,000 signatures, and Is there a gender and sexuality center on campus now? No. And now and they were ignored. If I'd have talked to them beforehand, I'd have said, folks, get a guarantee. If they say, you give us 2,000 signatures, we'll give you a center, fine. Don't do it the other way around and say, I hope you're really nice to us later on, because it's not going to happen. I'd never do a petition drive. I would never do anything unless, if I'm going to do it, you have to say that if I do it, I get it. I get what I ask for. If somebody sets up a thing and says, you know what we really need is, this is a very good issue, but why don't we sit down and set up a committee to study this?
Is that the kiss of death?
Oh, you're gone. You're gone. And it happens to everybody. There's a movement right now to put in marijuana dispensaries in Mount Pleasant. They sent some of the city commissioners, and they set up a commission. The commission came out and said, you know what we need is dispensaries have to be 300 foot from schools, and that's it. Great. When it went to the city commission, they are now suggesting one that is 1,000 foot from schools, 1,000 foot from churches, 1,000 foot from daycares, and 1,000 foot from parks. That leaves 3 blocks in the entire city. On the west side of Mission, it's the old antique store, which, by the way, a group immediately came in and kicked the other people out and gave the people a lot more money to rent the place. They're out of Royal Oak, and they already have 5 dispensaries. So we're talking, every time you went to a meeting about those, there'd always be a couple suits in the back. And you knew they were lawyers from someplace else. So get the guarantees before you do it.
From your experience, committees don't work, petitions don't work. What does?
What works, I'm not sure exactly what all works, but I can tell you at least one, and I gave you the article, and you can quote away.
While I'm looking it up, let me have you talk about this, and that is creating the next generation of leaders, because that is an important factor. I go
to some of the student organization meetings. I go to SAMRC, which is the students for student advocates for medical and recreational marijuana. They got a petition on the ballot here in Mount Pleasant. It passed with 63% to decriminalize marijuana in Mount Pleasant. And the change is, yeah, clap away, it didn't do anything. You still get arrested. It has nothing, because they say it's still under...
It will in November.
Hopefully. God, I'm hoping on that one. But there's no guarantee. If you're on campus, you're really doomed, because there is no, this is state property, and they don't handle pot like they do outside. You go to the student, student code enforcement? Student conduct. You can't bring a lawyer. You can bring a lawyer where you want, but they got to shut up. They can't say anything. The rules of evidence are completely against you. So there's those kind of things. But some of these things work, but you can go.
I have to share this because Matt made a point to find this. He was very excited when he gave it to me, because here is some advice that he says, it came from a letter to the editor. This was from 2015. And the idea is that how slow a process making change can be, this is what they're talking about, and that the students either need, quote, sustained support that we talked about, spanning many years, or to take direct action in order to see change on campus. And the speaker said the only recent example of successful student change was back when CMU students did not get classes off for Martin Luther King Jr. Day until they occupied a building and their demands were met. The speaker, according to this letter to the editor, was CMU President George Ross.
So, don't listen to me. Listen to an expert. If you want to get change, take over something. That's what the president suggests that you do. You know?
And may I clarify that the views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of WCMU Public Media.
There are lots of issues, and there are things that you people should be, the students here should be interested in. We have some really great things around. There are people at the reservation here who went to Dakota, and they have very interesting stories. As far as I know, none of them have ever spoke at CMU. Nobody's talked. I don't care if you're against it or for it. You can be completely against it, but it's an historical event. It should be interviewed. The marijuana policy in Michigan changed things around, that a lot of dispensaries in this state were closed. And it was because of a legal action in Mount Pleasant. The prosecutor is Larry Burdick. He's still here. The person who was the one who he charged is Brandon McQueen, who is still here, and by the way, on the school board. Yay. And they should be, bring them back, bring them into debate. And if you don't like, if you want somebody who can talk legalese with Burdick, you could bring in Matt Abel. Matt Abel has 2 qualifications. He is the president of Normal in Michigan, and he is the son of Harold Abel, the president of CMU.
Okay. So let me ask you, Matt, getting back briefly to this issue of continuity. As we were talking before, you said when it comes to campus protests, and particularly with students in for a semester, going back home for the summer, one of the greatest threats is simply delay.
Yeah, all you have to do is, all you need to do, you come up with some action. You're not going to, in September, you got to get things together. You couple months, you're working on it. You hit Thanksgiving break, you're doomed. You're no longer going to do anything the rest of that semester because nobody comes back from Thanksgiving break except studies for finals. Now you got Christmas break. Got to come back in January. Probably takes you a little while until February to get into action again. Hits February. All you got to do is delay it until spring break. Once spring break happens, nothing's going to happen over that. And as soon as you're in summer, you have to reinvent the wheel in the fall. And there's there are a lot of things that people could do here that, and I'm going to do this real quick. Sexual assaults on campus. According to the federal government, the percentage, the ratio for women who are sexually assaulted on campus is 1 in 4, 1 in 5. That works out to about 650 people a semester, a school year. According to SAPA, the group that helps with women that's on campus, usually that's not very, usually they don't tell you the numbers. One year they said 300. That same year, 650, now it's only 300. According to the university, there were 4. So what happened to all the others? Quickly, the university, just last week, they had to get, the university was told about a sexual assault. The university did not share their information with the local prosecutors. The local law enforcement had to subpoena the university to get them to tell what had happened. So who was the university interested in protecting? The person who was attacked or the sexual predator?
Well, this could be another discussion into itself. Yeah, and it is hard to know the motivations because of the laws involved and everything, but we're not going to go in that direction right now.
You should have another panel sometime for the history of feminism through the ages. I think there are some, you have qualified people here. You have people who started the Take Back the Night. Mm-hmm. You have rape counseling.
And as we're talking about feminists, we have one right next to you who has tremendous experience, and that's Janice Fialka. Yeah, and known because, as I hear, the personal is also political, and you depict that so very well. Give us a little background first. What was your involvement when you were at CMU?
Yeah, well, I definitely was involved. I wasn't in the building. I was outside the building, was involved in a lot of the marches, both here as well as in Washington, D.C. Eventually then, after even I left campus, I got involved in the Seneca Falls Peace Camp movement. There were women's peace camps that were around the world that were really protesting the deployment of the cruise missiles. Actually went to Greenham Common out in England, and we circled the base with thousands and thousands of women. So my commitment to peace definitely began here. My eyes were opened and continued. I think what I want to just share for the few minutes I have up here is the power of the women's movement here at Central. And through Kathy Courtney and many other people, they opened our eyes and began to help us know that we had lived a very limited life in many ways. In the first panel, you asked people what were your favorite songs. Yes. I'm going to read a part of one of my favorite poems, because one of the things that I did get involved here was learning a lot about poetry. And some of you may remember Marge Piercy, who grew up in Detroit. She's a poet, a feminist, and she spoke at CMU in the 1970s, part of that cultural thing that you talked about, Denny. And she wrote a poem using the bonsai tree as a metaphor. And I won't read the whole poem, but I want to read a little bit of it and bring her in and her image. And as you know, the bonsai tree is the Japanese art that really prunes back the trees, and that can be a very stunning work of art, but it's also a metaphor for oppression. So, the bonsai tree in the attractive pot could have grown 80 feet tall on the side of a mountain till split by lightning. But a gardener carefully pruned it. It is 9 inches high. And I think that many of us came to Central, especially the women, 9 inches high, if you will. I mean, I had a good life, but there was this incredible oppression that we really weren't totally aware of. It was sort of like this rumbling that we experienced. And so we were catapulted into a different way, a new way of being as women. And one of the ways that I think really transformed us, and all of us, men and women, is consciousness-raising groups. So this opportunity to bring women together in church basements, in hallways and dorms, all different places, and we began to tell our stories. Reluctantly at first, carefully, shyly, but our boldness, came through as we began to hear that what we were experiencing wasn't just personal, but it came out of an oppression. It came out of norms that really limited women. And that was a powerful moment for us. And I think that everyone here, especially women in this audience, can relate to what it was like for us then, because we have a resurgence of that with the Me Too movement, where women in particular, are being able to share, this is what I have gone through and I will take it no more. And so the lesson for us, and you can hear it in all of our stories, is that we're beginning to break the silence. And that's when Kathy was talking about, how do we do this? We do it by breaking the silence. We do it by telling our stories. We do it by listening to other stories as well. So I think that was a major part of what transformed me and continued to. And I would just share that one of my favorite quotes, because I end up being a storyteller, is words are how we think, stories are how we link, how we create community. And that's a lot of what, you can hear it in all of the stories that we've shared tonight. We've created a community. And I'll leap forward. I know we're sort of limited in time, but about 33 years ago, I gave birth to a son, my son Micah, who has an intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation. So initially, when I was still active around peace movements, but I saw what he was experiencing as sort of a special education issue. And then it hit me that this was a social justice issue. He belonged in this world as much as his peers who didn't have a disability. And I began to look back at what I learned in the women's movement, to break the silence, to know we belong, to not expect that the institutions were going to change because it was a good idea, but because we were going to seize it and make it happen. And so there's a book out there that describes his whole life, but what I want you to know is that he was fully included throughout his whole life. And really the roots of that happened for me here at Central, because we told stories, because we supported each other, because we took to the streets, because we started a women's center. There's that link that goes there as well. And I want to tell a very quick story. Our son Micah was part of the new wave of students with intellectual disabilities who went to college. Kids with mental retardation years ago didn't go to college. They went to community-based programs. But we created a fully inclusive program for Micah. He grew up with a sense of disability pride, very similar to the women's movement, that sense of ownership. And he decided that he wanted to move into the dorm. But kids like Micah didn't live in the dorm, but he was attending the university through a special program. And he decided that the university refused to let him live in the dorm. And he protested that, ended up suing the university. The story I want to tell comes out of the fact that he was in a deposition where he was grilled for 5 hours to find out why he was doing this. And about a week later, then we were deposed. And so the lawyers were asking me questions about Micah, and at some point, both lawyers went out of the room. And the court stenographer looked up at me and she said, "I know I'm not supposed to talk to you, but I just have to tell you that I was in the room when your son Micah was in the room, and you must be so proud of him." And I thanked her for that. And then she said, "I realized when I listened to Micah, your son, that my son has a disability, and I need to begin to be an advocate for him." Yeah. Read more about him. It's quite an amazing story. But that advocacy, that's the story, that our story moves people. Just like we're all 8 of us here are so eager to hear what you all want to say and share with us, because your story matters to us. There's that interplay between that, so ask me a question. I could go on and on, but yeah.
Well, I'm going to leave it so that the audience here in the auditorium can ask you some questions,
Great.
because there's so much that I know each of you can share.
Can I mention just real quickly?
Yes.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a couple people. Lou Oates, who has since passed, a brilliant African-American who was here on campus when we were here. John Fraker, who started the Tenants Union and used to drive down to Lansing to pick up the New York Times and bring it up here because we couldn't get it. And Paul Puma, who was very active in the peace movement and would be here today, except he's undergoing medical treatment in Houston.
Okay, very good, thank you.
I'd like to add 3 slogans, quick ones to encapsulate the whole thing that we've been talking about. Question authority, speak truth to power, and persistence prevails when all else fails.
Amen.
John, Denny, Matt, Janice, thank you for being on this panel this evening. Thank you for joining us as we talked about student activism then and now, and may we all follow our beliefs with passion and energy like the people we've heard from tonight. Thanks for joining us for this event, produced by WCMU Public Media. Good night.